right. All right. Want to welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. This is our series on human flourishing. And part of this conversation, if you're a guest with us, is one of our values is always truth, always love. And we are trying to engage in topics with the Bible as the source of our truth, but to do it with gentleness and respect. And we've engaged in a few of these topics already, but we wanted to have one today on the topic of human flourishing and what is the good life. And Dr. Jonathan Pennington was here this morning, and we had him back to lead us in this conversation this afternoon. We'll have some Q&A later, so keep that in mind. And Dr. Pennington will kind of break us down for that conversation as he's making his way through his talk. So if we could welcome Dr. Pennington.
Hey, thanks for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. This is great. There's a handout that you'll want to make sure you have or get in the back as we go along. I was driving up the interstate there and saw Station 45, The Good Life. I have no idea what that is. I assume it's a Christian television station or something. I have no idea what they think The Good Life is, but I was struck by that, yeah, this is a real issue. So anyways, okay. Well, you can see an opening question on there that I really do want you to think about and would love to hear some answers from you. And that is, what message did you receive from your parents, or maybe it was an aunt or uncle or sibling or something, it's probably most likely your parents, about what the good life is and how to obtain it? I'd really like you to think about it, because you all did receive a message. And I'm just curious if anyone can articulate what you think you got from childhood, especially what the good life. Anybody want to offer that? Yeah, please.
Diligent work.
Diligent work.
Pay attention to detail.
Okay.
Keep your nose clean.
Pay attention to details, keep your nose clean. Did you become an engineer or something, or what happened? No? Okay. But good. All right. Thank you. Somebody else. What message did you receive? Thank you so much. Yeah, please.
To always trust in God and look to Him for everything.
That's great. To trust in God and look to Him. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah.
Family life.
Family life, the good life we found by focusing on, I was about to say focus on the family, but focusing on your family, and yeah, okay, good. Yeah.
My father, who did not go to college, told me that high school would be the best years of my life.
That high school would be, and
So it's been a downhill.
it's a sad tale, at least for me. If high school were my best years, I was a very late bloomer, as some of you might be as well. Oh, one other person, maybe? What message did you receive about what the good life was? I mean, some people maybe you're embarrassed. Maybe for some people it was, be cutthroat, do whatever you can to make a lot of money. I mean, a lot of people have received that message. Maybe that's some of you as well. Yeah.
Go all over the world,
Go.
see everything.
Okay.
I did.
All right, go over the world and see things. Great. So the follow-up question I have from that, even for those of you who didn't, offer what you got, did that change for you at some point? I'm curious. Like, did something change, or do you feel like you're still living that out? And either way, totally honest question here, how has that worked out for you? Like the message that you received, maybe there's some good in it, maybe there's some bad. Did something change? And as you think back on your life so far, how did that do for you? Just curious if anybody's willing to be a little vulnerable and honest about that. Yeah, please.
That's my daughter, and I got the same message from my dad, which is this man. Trust God and follow Jesus hard.
Okay.
And so I would say it's worked out for me, although the circumstances weren't the way I thought they should go.
Okay, thank you.
But he's been reliable.
Yeah, well, that's a great message, and I'm glad to hear that. That's really good. Thank you. Anybody? Yeah, please.
I think my message was get a job that you will really like and that you're good at, and that'll be a good life. And I think it was true to a point, but then it's left me empty. I didn't grow up as a Christian, so once I became a Christian and realized, well, where's the meaning in this? So I think I'm still trying to figure that part out.
Thank you.
But
Yeah.
I think that's the big difference is if it was a good message, and it is good to have a job that I like, but it still.
Maybe not a complete enough message. So if you didn't hear that, then the answer was, get a good job that you like, and then that'll, I don't know if it was explicit that'll give you the good life, but at least implicitly so. And then, do you mind if I ask how old you are?
I'm 50.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's, yeah, Tyler and I were just talking about, 50, I'm only 53, so I'm not speaking from some great vantage point over 50, but, that's kind of 48 to 50-ish is a range, at least for a lot of striving people, men and women, where you do begin to wonder whether that message was enough, You're not alone in that, yeah. One more person maybe? Did something change for you in the message you got, and how's that worked out for you? Yeah, please.
I think for me it was more of actually thinking through that question and what does that really mean? Because I think a lot of the messages, even that we've imparted to our kids have not been like, oh, this is the good life, work hard, study hard. But it's like, what are the things that we put emphasis on and were important to us?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least they were.
So implicitly you were communicating that's what the good life is, yeah.
So I think it's been recently that I've been able to sit with that and even just try to think of how I'm communicating and what I'm communicating.
Yeah,
So that
that's good. Yeah, and this is not a parenting seminar by any means, but I think in our parenting and in other relationships too, it probably for most of us, we probably weren't necessarily consciously thinking about what we were communicating about what the good life is, but that is the point, that everything we do is communicating that we have valued something as the good life, or else we wouldn't do it, and even if we're not aware of it. And that's for ourselves and those we influence as well. But often we're not very thoughtful about what it is, and it's because nobody was thoughtful for us, beforehand. Well, that's what I want to talk about today a little bit, particularly as you can see from the handout, the title, What is the Good Life and How Do We Find It? And Christianity's Surprising Answer. And let me just say, I am honored, thrilled to be here. I'm so glad you're here. This is a lot more fun when other people are here. And let me say also that I love to dialogue. I really do, and we would love to hear from you. I'll pause at some moments. We won't just wait till the end and see if you have any questions of clarification. We'll have a mic that Tyler has just to make sure that people online can hear as well. But I just want you to know I love to dialogue during this and afterwards as well. I did bring a few of my books that are out there on the table, but there's lots of other materials if you want to think more, like hear some other lectures or sermons, other things I do as well. I have a website I think we listed on the bottom of on the page as well, and that's all I'll say about that. But let me start with this question, this next section there, of humanity's quest for happiness. I don't know if any of you have run across the truly international bestseller by Yuval Noah Harari. He's written several books, but this one I'm referring to is called Sapiens. And in it, what Harari does, and again, he's a Jewish scholar and brilliant, and there's millions and millions of copies of this all over the world. What he does is he very ambitiously traces human history over what he understands to be a 2.5 million year process of evolutionary biology. But what he's doing, he's not just writing like a biology text, he's actually trying to think about a large-scale understanding of how human civilization came to be, and even more than that, really a history of humanity itself, the species. So Homo sapiens, that's us, are simply, as he says, an animal of no significance that just happened to end up dominating over other genuses or genera of animals. There were other creatures or animals that are classified as Homo neanderthal and Homo denisovan as well. But he's concentrated on our version of it, the sapiens. And what he argues is that the reason we as Homo sapiens are dominant, and the fact that we can write books about ourselves being something that exists, which nobody else does. No other, birds are not writing books as far as we can tell about birds existing or whatever. The reason is because humanity went through multiple revolutions. He calls it the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, the scientific revolution. Now, this is not a talk about his book, et cetera. It's interesting to read. Of course, I disagree with tons of it. But he is a highly educated Homo sapient himself, and he certainly doesn't lack self-confidence, I'll say, in his description of how he understands how the world came to be. But again, I'm not really going to talk about that book, except for to point out something really, really interesting, is that near the end of the book, after this long, large-scale, very educated sort of understanding of how humanity came to be, he brings up a couple of key questions. One is, what is the future of Homo sapiens in light of technology? AI and biogenetic things. So he's just asking that question, like, here we are, what's the next stage for humanity? That's a very interesting question. He has some thoughts about it, okay? But the other question he asks about is the question of happiness. His penultimate chapter is entitled, "And They Lived Happily Ever After," and he states the problem well, and here's the quote from him you can see in the middle of the handout there. He says, "The last 500 years have witnessed a breathtaking series of revolutions. The earth has been united into a single ecological and historical sphere." Just think about that. That was never the case before, just in the last 500 years, that the whole globe is connected very quickly, right? The economy has grown exponentially. Humankind today enjoys a kind of wealth that used to be the stuff of fairy tales. Just think about that. The stuff that we have is like, couldn't have been imagined 200 years ago, 500 years, right? That I flew down to see Taylor Swift and I'm flying back tomorrow, right? I mean, that's amazing, right? Way to go, humanity, as I always say. And he says, science and the Industrial Revolution have given humankind superhuman powers, practically limitless energy. The social order has been completely transformed, as have politics, daily life, and human psychology. But here's the question. Even in light of all that, are we happier? Did the wealth humankind accumulated over the last 5 centuries translate into a newfound contentment? Has the cognitive revolution made the world a better place to live in? Was the late Neil Armstrong, whose footprint remains intact on the windless moon, was he happier than the nameless hunter-gatherer who 30,000 years ago left her handprint on a wall in the Chavot cave? It's very interesting that this is the question, one of the 2 main questions that Harari, again, very intelligent, Homo sapiens himself, he needs to answer and he needs to ask as he thinks about this kind of survey of human history. Are we happier? I mean, are we happy? I mean, it's really a question we can't avoid, nor should we. Harari's answer, if you keep reading, is actually no, that we don't seem to be. He acknowledges it's actually pretty hard to evaluate whether a peasant of the 13th century is happy or not, because we might say from our standards, of course he's not. We have healthcare, whatever. But he points out that, you can't just assume our standards and our expectations. And from what we can tell, like psychologically and socially, it doesn't seem like we're happier despite all the luxuries we have in our especially modern Western society. The real issue, Harari notes, is that we can't really define happiness as just kind of an emotional mathematics, that we're happy if we have a sum of more pleasant moments than unpleasant ones. Because he says the average person today, we have been enculturated to think that happiness means we have more pleasurable moments than non-pleasurable moments. But he points out, and rightly so, that happiness consists in seeing one's life as meaningful and worthwhile. I think he's right. That, like, if you were to ask yourself how would you define happiness? At first, especially when you're younger, a kid or something, you might think happy moments. But the more, as you age and think about the temporariness of everything, including happy emotions, you realize that what really happy means or flourishing means is a life that's actually meaningful and is worthwhile. And that idea of meaningfulness and worthwhileness is deeply embedded in this idea of happiness or human flourishing. Part of the problem is that the word happy in English now has become such a weak word. It just means a temporary state of emotion. And so that's why a lot of us use the word now in philosophy and theology. We use the word flourishing because it's a little bit better. It is better than happiness. The problem is all words get tired over time, and eventually flourishing will not work either. But for now, this is the word we use to describe something that the ancient philosophers talked a lot about as well. And you can see right under the first thing, I've got Harari, but I've got Augustine, Lowes, and modern philosophies. And what I mean by those categories is that, let me give you a quote from Augustine, because this is not just a modern thing. St. Augustine, arguably the greatest theologian after the New Testament, like countless thinkers, he reflected a lot about what Christian theology was and what it means to be human. And he boiled it down also to this question of meaningful happiness. In his very famous book, The City of God, in book 10 of that, he begins this way. He says, "It's the decided opinion of all who use their brains that all people desire to be happy." Of all the things that Augustine says in that very long book, he recognized that really at the central core of humans' desire is to be truly happy. We cannot not want happiness. He says this is what it means to have a brain. It's what it means to be human. I remember several years ago, I was standing in line at Lowe's. My son and I were adding a part to our deck, and I was standing in line with some, my cart of lumber, and I was in the middle of writing this book, Jesus the Great Philosopher, and I saw this, all the glossy magazines there, and there was, creative gardening and all these kind of things, and there was a magazine entitled The Happiness Formula: How to Find Joy and Live Your Best Life. And even though it was $12.99, ridiculous for a magazine, I did have to buy it. And what's inside this magazine that's offering happiness, even at Lowe's, you can find happiness even at Lowe's now, is a bunch of articles from what's called positive psychology about how to handle relationships in a good way and things to do, meditations to do in the morning, how to be more like the Swedish people who ride bikes everywhere and are very happy, et cetera, and practice yoga, et cetera. And again, I was just struck by, so here it is, even a home improvement store is offering happiness, and why not? I mean, after all, this is about as core as what it means to be American as well, right? It's in our Declaration of Independence. Do you forget this, right? That what are the things that we consider to be fundamental human rights? I don't mean that in a snarky way. I mean, that's really, and this comes from the French philosophical tradition that was underneath the American Revolution. What we consider to be basic human rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's a fundamental understanding that reflects really a universal human idea, okay? So the Greeks, way back, before we were talking about this in the French Revolution, the American Revolutions, they thought about this a lot as well. And they talked a lot and had a lot of different words for what it means to be truly happy. One of the words for it is the word makarios, which we'll meet here in a few minutes. Another is the word eudaimonia, and which comes across sometimes into English, things that are eudaimonistic. And what that means is, again, something like true happiness, or maybe better, human flourishing or soul flourishing. Or I think in the Old Testament, it'd probably be the word shalom, I think would be a good way to think about that. And so the point of all this, just as kind of an intro, is that this question of human happiness has been fundamental. It is for us today. And it actually has been in every religion, every philosophy, even though you may not think about it, and we'll come back to some of the objections to this, but it really is what drives people and always has been in so many ways. Now, there's more we could say about it, but what I want to say, I give you tonight's big idea, that at the core of the Christian faith is a commitment to and an exploration of the nature of true human flourishing, the good life or happiness. And Christianity, rooted in the person and teachings of Jesus, provides a robust, nuanced, comprehensive, and satisfying vision for the life. So that's right there on the handout there, just so you know what I'm trying to go for. But here's the issue, and here's how I'm going to frame the rest of my time with you. There's my statement. There's the idea I want you to get from tonight. But I think there's two surprising things that probably come out of that. One is that I think it's probably a surprise maybe to many of you to think that Christianity has anything to do with happiness. I'm curious if I could do like a little biometric scan on your temperature and your agitation level. Which of you, if I could, who knows, maybe I do have that and you don't know that, but I don't. But like, do you like that idea of talking about Christianity's happiness? I bet some of you feel like, that seems weird. No, I don't like that. That's not wrong, or that's wrong, that's not biblical. Some of you may be curious, some of you may be interested in it, but I think we'd all have to admit that's not the normal way we talk about Christianity, as being about happiness, and we'll come back to that. And then the second surprise is, I think, the most profound, is that the way the Bible does talk about what happiness is very unexpected. Okay, so those are the two surprises about Christianity and happiness that I want to talk about briefly with you tonight. But as I said, let me pause and just see, from what I've said so far, I was going to give it a brief version of it. Do you have any questions, clarification on what I'm talking about? And I may have to punt so that I'm going to address what you're saying, but I'll just pause for a second. The idea of happiness and how central it is to human experience. Questions on that or thoughts? And if not, that's okay too. Just wanted to give you a chance to dialogue if you want to. Please, yep.
I was having a quiet time this week and I was laughing.
Okay, good.
Because I really enjoyed what Peter was saying, and I hit that very idea that this is really a happy time this morning.
Okay, that's good. I'm glad that doesn't feel adverse to you then.
It's not the first.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of moments in Scripture.
Okay, thank you.
What's the difference between happiness and joy?
Yeah, good. What's the difference between happiness and joy? Yeah, it's funny. I lecture on this stuff all over the place, and I have run across many times, so it must be kind of out there in Christian teaching that I just haven't run across. A lot of times people have asked me about that and have indicated that they've been taught that there's a difference between happiness and joy, and that happiness, I think, probably would be taught as maybe not something necessarily good or even to pursue, and then joy is like a spiritual kind of happiness. Is that what you'd pick up on that? Yeah. I don't think I do. I mean, but it is interesting how often I hear that. And I think it probably lodges in people's minds, because that is a really good question. Like, when the Bible talks about joy and happiness, what does it mean? And especially because, again, I think we do have a kind of an adverse reaction to happiness. Like, that doesn't sound like a normal word for us to talk about. And I understand why. But I do not see that distinction really working out in the Bible at all. I don't really see the Bible distinguish between happiness and joy. Happiness is, I mean, if you're talking about the English word today, happiness probably is too weak of a word, right? I'm trying to kind of re-inject it with some life, or use the word flourishing if we can. So I think that's probably the motivation for people making that distinction between happiness and joy, is to say it's not just circumstantial, it's actually joy in the Lord. And that I totally agree with. I just don't think that you can really find that distinction in the Bible per se. And I also think that there's probably a too negative a view of happiness that's motivating that, which I want to address. So that's a great question, though. Thank you. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts? And I'm sorry if you're like a professional Bible teacher who has a book on happiness versus joy. I apologize. I will trust that you're right, and I will just eat my words and say I'm wrong and you're right. So I'm sorry if that's, I'm not trying to throw shade on anybody. So. Okay, well, let me go on then to the first surprise, Christianity's interest in happiness, because this is kind of the issue. So I think there are a lot of reasons why any of us here might initially object to my assertion that's in that big idea that Christianity is about happiness or flourishing. For example, I can think of that sounds really selfish. I mean, after all, didn't Jesus say, take up your cross and follow me, deny yourself? Or what about the idea that maybe many of us might have a reaction about, if you start talking about Christianity and happiness, many of us probably think of like the health and wealth gospel, which is, I assume you have some idea what that is, which is the fastest growing kind of version, and it's a perversion, I think, of Christianity throughout the world, which really emphasizes that you too can be, wealthy and be healed of everything if you just have faith. And of course, it almost always, if not always, ends up being a scam, to make money and to have power over people. So maybe when we think of like happiness, maybe we think that's not the gospel. I don't want to be part of that thing. And we might ask again, isn't Christianity about self-sacrifice and love for others, Jesus' death on a cross and service? Doesn't the Bible emphasize that we're wicked and sinful and broken, not happy? And some might even say, isn't Christianity really not about this world that's going to go to hell in a handbasket, but instead it's about getting out of this place and getting free from this and getting to heaven or something? And finally, I think for many people, religion and Christianity are not particularly viewed more broadly or in broader culture in a positive way. And many people, maybe not you guys, but many people, their experience of Christianity has not been very happy at all. Maybe it was just a place of legalism and a place of oppression, maybe even abuse, sadly. Right, so I think there's a lot of reasons why people, including us, might feel odd to say that Christianity is actually about happiness, but I think there are a lot of reasons to actually rediscover this idea that the Bible really is about the good life or flourishing or happiness. And part of the reason I think we aren't used to thinking about Christianity in relationship to happiness or flourishing is because there's something we don't understand that's crucial about the New Testament, okay? So in my field of scholarship, I'm a New Testament scholar. I spend a lot of my life doing that. And in my field of New Testament, the last, 70, 80 years have mostly been dominated in New Testament studies by reading the New Testament from the perspective of the Jewish world, what we call Second Temple Judaism, which basically means from 515 BC to AD 70 or so, and recognizing that the New Testament is part of this kind of world of the Old Testament, but then especially kind of between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's a lot of important stuff that happens in Judaism, and there's been a lot of reading of the New Testament with that kind of as the background. The Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe you've heard of that as contributes to that, et cetera. And that's all great. I don't want any less of that. But there's actually another crucial part about the background to the New Testament that is not as familiar to us in this generation. It was in earlier generations. And that's that the New Testament comes to us not only out of Judaism, Jesus is a Jew and Christianity is the fulfillment of the Jewish hopes, but it also comes at this intersection point with another cultural world, and that is the world of Greek and Roman culture and philosophy. And we don't tend to think of that because we just don't know as much about it. Generations past that were more trained in the classics would have seen this more clearly, maybe with the classical school movement, which is big. Now, there's probably more familiarity of this now. But the point is that intersection point is so important that the New Testament's not written in Hebrew. I don't know if that's dawned on you, right? Which is pretty shocking. For it to be the sort of fulfillment of Judaism in the Old Testament. And I'm glad, because I like Greek a lot more than Hebrew. My Greek's a lot better than my Hebrew, so I'm thankful. Whew, dodged a bullet there. But it's written in Greek to and from a very Greek and Roman culture, which again is not something we're as familiar with when we read it. Now, don't hear me saying that unless you understand all the classics or something, you can't read the New Testament. It's not at all what I'm saying. But I'm saying there are parts of the cultural background and there are things that the New Testament is addressing that we probably don't see very clearly because we do lack some of that understanding. Just like you can read the New Testament without understanding anything about the Old Testament, you certainly can. You can get its basic message. But the more you understand of the Old Testament, the more the New Testament's going to make sense, right? Can you understand that? Well, not to the same degree, but to the same idea, the more we understand the kind of things that Paul's interacting with, and that even Jesus is interacting with, that come from the Greek and Roman world, they're going to help us understand things more about what's going on in the New Testament. Okay, if that makes sense. Just like if, 1,000 years from now, bad analogy because I'm not writing scripture in any of my books, but 1,000 years from now, if somebody picked up one of my books or, manuscripts, I'm sure it'll still be in print then, and at least you can do your part, right, today. If somebody picked that up 1,000 years from now and they could read the language that it's in, they'd understand some of it, but they would miss a ton of it, right? That's just natural because it's going to be from a different time and culture, right? Now, again, I'm not saying we can't read the New Testament without understanding all this, but I'm just saying I want to just give you an idea here about what's going on in the New Testament that might make a lot of sense, and it's simply this, that in the first century, in Jesus' day, was a very Greco-Roman culture where there was a lot of philosophy going on. And that philosophy was not what you and I think of philosophy as kind of like this, esoteric big ideas. When we leave the room, does the chair still exist? And how do you know that? Kind of stuff, which is interesting. I actually don't mind that kind of stuff. But in the ancient world, philosophy was not this abstract esoteric stuff. People like Aristotle and Plato, they were not just abstract thinkers. They were all motivated by what is the good life? That's actually why you did philosophy in the ancient world. They wrestled a lot with how do you live a good life? What are your emotions and how do you handle them? What kind of relationships did you develop in your family and with government? What does your body have to do with living a flourishing life? They thought about all these things. They lived together in communities and wrestled with them and thought about them. Aristotle, Plato, and then later and then later the Stoics especially. This is this very popular version of philosophy in Jesus' day that Paul is clearly interacting with. Once you read the Stoics and you read Paul, you're like, he's clearly interacting with this. They emphasized, it was like kind of like Oprah Winfrey and Jordan Peterson and I don't know, who would be popular? I don't know. The top 5 TikTok people, I don't know, who else would be? Yeah, Joe Rogan, that's right, yeah. It'd be like all those people combined together and put together a philosophy. That's how influential Stoicism was. It was like the main way that people kind of wrestled with how to think. And there were a lot of Jewish people that were thought about this stuff as well. Like Philo, you may or may not have heard of him. He was clearly a Greek philosophically trained Jew. And the point is that all of those people thought a lot about and talked a lot about what it means to be truly happy. And they used certain words and terms that we actually see in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament, that I think are very clearly that Jesus and Paul and the other New Testament authors are interacting with. Granted, they're giving answers that are different than the world around them, but they're addressing the exact same issues. And that's what Christianity has always done well. When it goes into any culture, it engages it. It doesn't run over it. It engages it. And over time, playing the long game, Christianity really transforms cultures. But not like jihadism, at least it shouldn't be. We've had eras of that. But Christianity does not come into a culture and force things on it, but instead educates and transforms at the heart level, and over time really results in a transformation. This is the genius of Christianity. Like, just to take Islam, for example, when you take Islam to another culture, it requires the culture coming in and even the language. You cannot translate the Quran to another language and it still be the Bible or still be the Quran, right? Christianity has always said, we are going to translate the truth, the universal truth of the gospel into different languages and different cultures and transform those cultures and those people over time. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is what's happening in the New Testament already. I think they are clearly engaging with the great universal human questions about what it really means to live the good life, using a lot of the same terminology that Aristotle and others did and transforming it. And so what I give you here is what we can sum up as these fundamental universal human questions that I think the Bible is dealing with as well. I'll give you the fancy terms for them as well. What's the nature of reality and how does it function? That's what we call metaphysics. How do we know anything and know it rightly? What we call epistemology. What's the good life, the true and the beautiful? Or what's the true, the good, and the beautiful? What we call ethics. And how do we best structure society and relationships? And the point is, this is what ancient people thought explicitly about. And this is exactly what the Old and New Testament, I would suggest to you, is interacting with and providing its own true answer. I give you this great quote from Runar Thorstein's son, because that name is just like, we're all envious. I mean, if we all wish we were Icelandic. This is an Icelandic New Testament scholar. I mean, you got to admit, that is a killer name. So it's my stage name, Runar Thorstein's son. But here he's talking about, he says, very much unlike the modern conception, the first century of the Christian era, philosophy was considered above all a way of life. Whatever the differences between the ancient philosophical schools, Aristotle, Plato, others, they all shared the basic purpose of trying to establish a bond between philosophical discourse and a way of life. The point is simply that this is what ancient people thought about, and I think if you start going to the Bible with these kind of questions, you'll see that the Bible is seeking to answer these questions as well. I don't have time to get into all the things that there's Plato and Aristotle and others, but if you can just trust me for a minute, that those have been for millennia the big questions humans have asked themselves. Actually, just look back at that page for a second. Let me just ask you, does the Bible have anything to say about those 4 big universal questions? Well, I hope you can see it does. In fact, it's a really helpful way to think about what the Bible's doing, Old and New Testament. What's the nature of reality and how does it function? I mean, the Bible very much cares to tell us that, right? If you start right in the beginning in Genesis, this would have been understood in the ancient Near East and in the first century as providing a philosophical metaphysic, that is, a way of understanding how did the world come to be, right? What does it mean to be human? Like, what's the difference between males and females? Like, is there a God and what's the relationship? What is humanity's relationship to the creatures around it? Like, how did this all come to be? That's what the Bible is seeking to answer, because any good philosophy requires that you have an understanding of what the nature of reality is. Aristotle has his view on it. Plato has his view on it. Socrates has his view. The Bible has what we believe to be the true view of it, but what's the nature of reality? Or epistemology. Does the Bible have much to say about how do you really know things? That's a sincere question. What's the Bible say about how we know things and how do you know them truly? That's not a rhetorical question, I'm really asking that. Yeah, the Bible, right? Yeah, he abided me, yeah. But yeah, so Jesus talking about abiding and coming to, and then maybe along the same lines, the Holy Spirit being a role in that. What else?
Basic discipleship is what you're trying to point out. Go to the Word for your answer.
Yes, what I'm asking though, I agree. What does the Bible itself say about what knowing is? You know what I'm getting at? Yeah.
I'm not sure this is really.
It's okay. Yep.
It comes from hearing and hearing over the whole verse.
Okay. Yeah. So the centrality of God's speech. What else? Yep.
Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the future set you free."
Okay. Yeah. So knowing. Yeah. So I started thinking of all the knowing verses. Anybody else?
Fear of God is the beginning of knowledge.
Yeah. These are all true, but that's the first thing that comes to mind for me. Is that the ability to know things is related to a posture toward God. That's not the answer you're going to get in an epistemology class at the university for sure, but it is what the Bible would say, that our ability to know things is related to our posture and attitude toward God. That's pretty important, right? And in fact, you start paying attention to all the talk about knowledge and wisdom in the Bible, there's a lot of it. In other words, it's providing a very thoughtful epistemology and understanding of how the world can be. Is there much in the Bible about what's the true, the good, and the beautiful? Of course. I mean, Old and New Testament, there's so much teaching about how to live, how to inhabit the world in a way that is honoring to God and brings life to you and others. And then how do we structure society and relationships? There's a lot of the Bible about that. In fact, one of the people that helped me see this first was a Jewish scholar named Yoram Hazony, is a modern Israeli scholar whose book is called The Philosophy of the Hebrew Scriptures. And he does a great job of just showing how he doesn't word the categories exactly the same way, but the same thing. And he shows that the Old Testament is very much a book of philosophy, meaning that it's providing a comprehensive view of what the world is and how to live in it. It's a really great way to read it. And then I would argue the same thing for the New Testament. So the point of this whole thing, and again, there's a lot more that we could say, and we'll at the end, we'll talk about, we'll do some Q&A and see what you want to say. But the point of this first surprise is that I hope I've begun to whet your appetite to say, actually, the Bible has a lot to do with happiness. It's actually providing a philosophy of life, a way of thinking about the world for the purpose of providing true life. After all, what does Jesus say? I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. I know you and I, when we hear that phrase, we think maybe of disembodied existence in heaven. But my point is, anybody hearing Jesus say that in the first century, Jewish people or Greek or Roman people, they would think he's offering a philosophy. That's the point. I'm coming to bring you life, just like Peloton offers that to you, and Amway, and Jordan Peterson. Do you know who Jordan Peterson is? Yeah, Joe Rogan. I mean, everybody's offering you something, underneath it is an offer of life. That's exactly what the Bible's doing too. Is the point? Okay. Now, there's more we could say. Let me go on for time's sake, and because this is where the real money is. I think if you could trust me that there's something to what I was just saying. I have a whole book on it out there. This is not a sales pitch, but just so, because there's more to say. It's called Jesus the Great Philosopher, and that's the whole point, is I trace through and just show, when you think about the Bible with these questions, it starts making a lot of sense. Please hear me clearly. I'm not saying it's not also the message that we do talk about. I'm not here to say everything you've ever heard about the Bible is wrong, tar and feather him. Quite the opposite. The gospel, all the things we talk about are true. I'm not trying to take anything away from that. I'm trying to put that in a larger frame to say the point of the Bible is that God is revealing the true way of understanding who we are and how to live in the world. That's like the big frame of what the Bible is about, okay, which we can call a philosophy, okay? So that's the first surprise maybe to us, that the Bible is actually about philosophy, okay, or a way of life. But here's the second one that would be the shock, the second surprise to anybody, okay? And that is that Christianity's answer to the question of what the good life is not what anybody today or in the ancient world would have accepted. That is, even if we accept that the Bible cares about the good life, I don't think anybody would be prepared to receive what Jesus and the apostles say what the good life truly is. It is counterintuitive, it's topsy-turvy, and so, the way I always like to say this is, the Bible is asking the same question that all humans ask: what is the good life? Where do you find true life or life abundantly? But the answer it gives is truly unique. And I think the best place to start in answering that question is where Jesus himself starts. And it's in the first message he gives in the first book of the New Testament, which is Matthew. And it's something you've been in, and it is the Sermon on the Mount. And the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 3-12, we call the Beatitudes. And maybe you talked about this when you preached on this. I don't know. So you're stealing all my thunder. No, that's good. I'm glad if you've already been educated on this. But what's a Beatitude? Does anybody know? We translate it as a blessing, but where's the word Beatitude come from? I mean, this is one of those funny words that you kind of heard it all your life, and then you're like, oh, what does that actually mean? Beatitude? What is that, right? Or is it a be happy attitude? Or what? I mean, like, we've used that word, we see it in our Bibles, but what actually does that word mean? Did you talk about this in a sermon?
Maybe I did, but if
it was a while ago.
I've also forgotten.
Yeah, okay, great. That's great. That's fine. I have not forgotten, right? So what, anybody know what that word means?
I was thinking in terms of those of the attitudes.
I mean, that's not what the word means, but, I mean, there's a sense in which that's kind of true, but that isn't what does anybody happen to know? It's okay. Come on, classical school people here?
Is it happy?
Yes. I guess, well, that's right. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, because we're talking about it. That was like the old Sunday school answer.
Some translations say happy.
Some translations do say happy, that's why. So the Latin word beatus means happy, okay? And underneath that is the Greek word makarios, which also means happy. And underneath that is the Hebrew word, which also means happy, Asher, which if you see that name Asher sometimes, that means happy. It occurs in Hebrew in Ashrei, so in what's called the construct form. So Ashrei, so happy or flourishing is the one. What does that sound like? You know what I was just quoting there? Psalm 1, the head of the Psalter, in many ways the most important psalm, the one that starts off the whole book of the Psalms. Starts with, again, we translate it as blessed, just like we do. But those three words in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, the reason we call them the Beatitudes is because these are not statements about blessing, especially in the English sense of that, receiving a blessing from God, even though it sounds like that in our ears. Macarisms, Beatitudes, Asherisms, if we can make up a word, are statements of happiness. They are what a father or a mother says, what's the good life? It's the message you receive. Maybe it was explicit, maybe it was implicit. Here's the way of inhabiting the world that's going to bring you life. Whether it's be cutthroat or focus on family, whether it is get as much money as you can or be a person of faith. Those are Asherisms. We all, philosophers, parents, sages, rabbis, people offer Asherisms or Macarisms or Beatitudes to each other because they are what shape us. In the ancient world, here's one from Seneca, one of the great Stoics. He said, you can tell the character of every man when you see how he gives and receives praise. So that's like an aphorism or a asherism even that shows you kind of a way of inhabiting the world, thinking about how you receive praise. Or the Stoics also talked a lot about memento mori. Anybody know what that means? That means remember your death. So the Stoics said every day you should think carefully about the fact that you're going to die, and that should shape how you live. Or amor fati, love whatever hand fate has dealt you. That's a big Stoic principle. Or pre meditatio malorum. These are all the Stoic phrases, the Stoic Beatitudes, which says, think about all the worst things that could happen to you, is what they say, morning and night, so that you can kind of like be free from its power over you. Okay? Those are just some examples of like Stoic ones. Gandhi, he offers us some. Live as if you were to die tomorrow. Learn as if you were to live forever. Okay? Seneca again, no good thing is pleasant to possess without friends to share it. It's good. Mark Twain, never put off until tomorrow what you can do the day after tomorrow. Or Taylor Swift, since I just saw her on Thursday, quoting her grandmother in the song Marjorie, never be so kind, you forget to be clever. Never be so clever, you forget to be kind, etc. All of those kind of sayings that every culture has, proverbs is another thing to describe them, these are visions for how to inhabit the world that's going to bring you the life that you long for. And that's what a beatitude is. That's what a macrism is. That's how Jesus starts his very first teaching in the Sermon on the Mount with 9 statements about what true happiness is. And so that's not even debatable. I know that our English translations say blessed, but it's only in English that that confusion comes in. I have taught this all over the world. I've talked to students, people that are bilingual in many other languages. Every one I've found so far, their language distinguishes happiness from blessings or flourishing from blessings, except for English. We use the same word blessing for both of them, and it creates a ton of confusion because when we read the Beatitudes, we think that they're statements about Jesus blessing us or God blessing us. They're not. They're statements of wisdom from Jesus, the ultimate wisdom incarnate, who's saying, I'm going to show you where true life is to be found. Anybody hearing Jesus say that in the first century would have known exactly what he was saying, because that's what everybody did. Every philosopher and rabbi went around and said, here's how to live. Here's what true happiness is. So that part is not surprising. It's surprising to us because we translate as blessing. There's clearly statements of happiness. That's what a beatitude is. That's what an asherism is. Here's the shocking part. Let me read them for you. Matthew 5:3. I'm going to translate as flourishing because I think that's a better translation. Flourishing are the poor in spirit. Flourishing are those who mourn. Flourishing are the humble. Flourishing are those hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Flourishing are the merciful. Flourishing are the pure in heart. Flourishing are the peacemakers. Flourishing are the ones persecuted on account of righteousness. And flourishing are you whenever people revile and slander and speak all kinds of evil things against you on account of me. Now, even in saying those, maybe you still think, oh, okay, those are good. But I need you to realize that every one of those, with the exception of pure in heart, is a shockingly negative statement. Flourishing in the poor in spirit. Again, the problem is we're so used to hearing these things in like a positive spiritual way that we think these are positive things. You got to let them hit for what they're saying. Poverty of spirit, the metaphor there is like poverty. You have nothing. He's saying the place of actual flourishing is when in your heart you recognize your brokenness, you recognize your poverty. That's not a pleasant experience, at least not initially. But he's saying that's the happiness. I mean, if you and I were to define, give me 10 things that make you happy, how many of us would put recognizing that I am broken irreparably in my heart? None of us would say that. We'd say chocolate, pasta universal, whatever it is, right? But he's saying flourishing are the poor in spirit. Flourishing are the mourners, those who all of us at any point, and those who are tapped into deep grief for the brokenness of the world in our own lives and the lives of others. Flourishing of the humble. Again, that has become such a positive spiritual Christian thing, which is good. That's the influence of Jesus on us. But flourishing the humble means you don't win. Humble means you're not on top. Humble means a lot of times you don't get the recognition or the justice you deserve. Flourishing are the ones hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Again, that sounds so super spiritual, like, oh, you love, Jesus and him forgiving you. No, notice the metaphors. Hungering and thirsting. Those are metaphors of poverty. Those are metaphors of desperation. And I think particularly the context of this is the book of Isaiah, all the Beatitudes. And I think what this is saying is hunger and thirst for righteousness. Righteousness meaning God coming and setting the world to right. To hunger and thirst for righteousness means that you see the brokenness in your life and in the world. You see divorces and cancers and abuse. You are aware. Are there children in here? Okay. You're aware of the fact that many people right now are booking tickets to go to Thailand to engage in activities that they should not be. Does that make any sense? You see these things. You see them in yourself. You see them in others. And you mourn for it, and you're broken for it. And all you can do is cry out for God to come and set the world to right. Jesus says that's the place of flourishing. Flourishing are the merciful. Again, that might sound positive, but that means is that when someone's wronged you, when someone's taken something from you, that instead of insisting on justice, you forgive them. Flourishing are the peacemakers, verse 9. That's the same kind of thing. You're burying the hatchet. You're making peace with those, even if you don't get justice. And if you still think it's positive, did you catch those last ones? Flourishing are the ones who are persecuted on account of righteousness. How many of you like to be, when you've done what's right, to be maligned and misrepresented? It's the worst. It's not just for us Enneagram 3s. I know for me, it's the very worst. My identity is my performance, so I want to be recognized for my great performance. But none of us want to be misrepresented and maligned. And then he doubles down on that when he says in verse 11, flourishing are you when people revile you, slander you, speak all kinds of evil on account of me. So what's not surprising in the first century is that Jesus is offering 9 statements on what it truly means to be happy. What is shocking, because he's a philosopher, he's a sage, that's what he would do. What is shocking is that the way he defines it is completely counterintuitive. And herein lies the depth of the beauty and the profundity of the paradox of Christianity. That true life is found not when everything goes well for us, though that's great. I mean, God is blessing and that's our ultimate goal. But true life, paradoxically, ironically, mysteriously, is actually found through suffering. It's found through a realism that engages and embraces the brokenness in ourselves, the brokenness of the world, doesn't deny it, but in faith and in hope, verse 12, we can even rejoice and be glad, not because the suffering we're having is inherently good. It's not because the suffering isn't wrong. It is wrong. The brokenness we feel, the injustice that occurs to us or that other people do, shootings and murders and cancers, all those things are bad. Christianity does not baptize the bad into the good in the sense of like saying, oh, these things are actually good. Nor does it do what Buddhism and Stoicism do, which are to say none of those things are really real. I mean, the key to Buddhism and Stoicism, which are related, is that you can find happiness by just saying none of that matters. It's all in your mind. You're only as hurt as you imagine yourself to be. Christianity is not that. Christianity is real. Just if you were here this morning when I was talking about anxiety, Jesus acknowledges there are plenty of things to be anxious about in the world. He's not denying the reality that, but he's inviting us here in the Beatitudes there in chapter 6 as well, to translate the reality of that suffering into a new key, to transpose it, to translate it into a different language, to transport it into a new soil. And that is in a place where it's read and understood and experienced in light of the fact that God is real, that he cares, and that he is at work in going to set the world to right. That he is at work through Jesus, the incarnation of Jesus, and his life and death and resurrection and ascension and session, his seating at the right hand of the Father. Those things have inaugurated a new reality in the world. They have transformed and they are transforming the reality that God has become a person, and he himself experienced all these things: poverty of spirit and mourning and humility and hungry and thirsting for righteousness and being merciful and being a peacemaker and being persecuted. He experienced these things, and in that he forges a way and models a way for us to actually embrace the reality of suffering in our lives and brokenness and actually find it as life, not as death. To find it as real life. This is a shock. But as soon as you start to lean into it, and as soon as you embrace it, and maybe even this afternoon you're already beginning to taste some of this. Maybe you have tasted this before. Maybe it's the first time. You're beginning to see that this is so much more satisfying, so much more real, so much more powerful than all the false alternatives that are out there. One being God's not in control and everything that happens is just evil and nothing matters, a kind of nihilism. Or on the other hand, hey, it's all fine, it's going to be fine. This kind of rubber stamp Romans 8:28ing that we do in Christianity sometimes. That's not real, right? Romans 8:28 is real, but the way we use it as a rubber stamp, hey, all's working out for good. I'm sorry your child died. All's going to work out for good. Don't say that, because that dishonors the reality of the suffering that Jesus does not dishonor. Jesus says these are the realities that are not to be denied, they're not to be written off, they're not to be super spiritualized, but they're to be leaned into, because life is to be found paradoxically in the way of suffering. And it's so complicated because, again, we can mess this up in so many ways. We can say, okay, well, I guess I should pursue suffering. Of course not. These things are not inherently good, but it's a reframing of our hearts and our minds and our understanding of where true life is to be found. And that's what Jesus the philosopher, Jesus the prophet, Jesus the sage, Jesus the Son of God is offering to us, right? And it turns out this isn't just in the New Testament. It's not just in the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, it's throughout the Bible, but this is a very clear and powerful way that we see it at work. And I think the word, so here I give you on the second page of the handout there, this great quote from Darius Karlovich. He says, "The task of all philosophy, including the Christian philosophy, which I think is a great way to think about what Christianity is, the way of life, is the therapy of souls who have been led astray by the demands of the passions and false pictures of happiness." That's a really helpful way to think about what Christianity is doing, what God is doing in us, is that he is sculpting away, carving away, remolding these false senses of where life is to be found from us and offering us this paradoxical but more powerful and nuanced and beautiful and sophisticated way of understanding. And I say there's Stoicism and Christian hope because my point here is that I do think the word that kind of brings this all together in the New Testament is the word hope. Now, like the word happiness, the English word hope has probably become too weak. It could mean like, man, I hope that happens or something. But biblical hope is a confidence, an assurance based on who God is and what he has done in what is going to come to be, that God is going to set the world to right. And the reason I say Stoicism there is because I've mentioned Stoicism a couple times. Stoicism was and is a very powerful philosophy. That is that the good of Stoicism is that I think it helps people take responsibility for their own lives. It helps people recognize that a lot of the things that are upsetting us shouldn't upset us, so there's a lot of good in it. Stoicism was very popular in the ancient world. It actually has been making a comeback. There's like a whole world of kind of modern Stoics. I'm just curious, if any of you are familiar with like Ryan Holiday or any of this kind of world? Yeah, some of you are. I mean, I like it. I read Stoicism all the time. I like Seneca. I like all this stuff. So I think a lot about Stoicism, but what's fundamentally different about Stoicism and Christianity is that ultimately Stoicism just ends up being about yourself and has no real reason, no real hope, no way to resource how to live virtuous lives ultimately, because it's just about you finding your own happiness, where Christianity also cares about your happiness, but it roots it in embracing the reality of brokenness while offering this sure and certain hope, again, that God is at work in the world, manifested by Jesus, and is at work in the world, setting the world to right. And so what I say there, then the next line on the handout, the particularly Christian vision and version of human flourishing. So my point is the Bible is about human flourishing or happiness, the good life. It's robust, it's nuanced, it's comprehensive, and it's satisfying. What I mean by each of those adjectives, robust, again, it embraces the reality of brokenness, like we said, it embraces the totality of our experience as humans. It's nuanced in that, again, it doesn't deny these realities or just kind of rubber stamp them, but recognizes there's a paradox in them. It's comprehensive. And what I mean by that is it really gives this incredibly large vision of the whole range of human experience. I was talking to somebody after my sermon this morning. I was preaching this morning on anxiety, if you weren't here. And I was talking to somebody about emotions afterwards, and one of the things that's really striking is that the Bible embraces and talks about all of our human emotions. Just look at the book of Psalms, where you've got lament and anger and joy and disappointment and grief and fear. And there's no denying of those reality. It's comprehensive, its understanding of humanity, and it offers a way for us to learn to process and live with those emotions in the presence of God, right? And then satisfying, let me just say here, just to testify as someone who's been following Jesus for 35 years, some of you much longer than that, I realize, I spent my childhood a mess, from the death of my father as a young boy at 2, all the way through adolescence of just heavy metal, hair down the middle of my back, smoking pot every day. It was a mess, and I was not happy. I mean, I was miserable. And at age 18, somebody from Campus Crusade shared the 4 spiritual laws with me, and I became a Christian that day, right, September 20th of 1988. And I could say in these 35 years of many ups and downs that I just have to echo the words of Peter when he said to Jesus, do you remember in John chapter 6, when Jesus gives this hard teaching about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, and a bunch of people say, I'm out, this is too much. And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, are you going to leave too? Do you remember what Peter says? Where else will we go? You have the words of life. Do you hear that? That word life. Every time you see life in the Bible now, you should think philosophy of flourishing, because that's what that means. You alone have the words of life. And I just want to testify through much suffering, self-inflicted and non, that this is what I have found. That there is no one else who has the words of life other than Jesus. And I'll just end with this interesting little phrase from the Christian artist and poet Sarah Groves. Do you know her? I think she kind of was more probably, we have a little older crowd here, so you might know her more, but she was probably more active, I would guess, in the probably 2000 aughts or something, around 2010 or so. But I really like her music a lot, very thoughtful, soul care kind of oriented Christian artist. And she has this powerful song called This House or This Old House or something like that, where she is going back home because her elderly parents are selling the home she grew up in. It's really powerful. And she goes back, she takes her young daughter with her, and she just is walking around the house. It's empty now. It's really moving. And she just describes how this was her whole world, and how it seemed like everything when she was little, but it's now cracked open, and she became someone different, and she's going, and just that power of going back home. Many of you have had that experience. And she sings near the end of the song, she describes what her upbringing in this Christian home was, with these 4 words that I've just found so powerful. Sad, fruitful, broken, true. Sad, fruitful, broken, true. It just really struck me, that's a great picture of living a real life in the presence of God that we experience, that the faith provides us and helps us to experience our lives truthfully as there's sadness, there's brokenness, but there's fruitfulness, there's truth, there's transformation, there's life to be found. And so my point and my hope this afternoon for you is just to begin to crack open your heart and mind to sort of see, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 1,000th time, it's okay, wherever you are today, that Jesus and the Bible are offering a beautifully powerful, practical, and realistic understanding of what it means to be human. What it really means to be human. That Christianity is not just this religion for the religious bucket of our lives. Christianity is providing, it's modeling in Jesus, and it's providing the teachings of what it means to be truly human, to understand the complexity of your lives with all its good and its joy and its brokenness and its mistakes and its failures, and to see this as something that God has become incarnate to honor and to redeem completely. And that if you want to answer the question of what is the good life, you can go a million places in the world, but I'm commending to you that you get on your knees, open Holy Scripture, listen to the Lord, and I think you will find no greater and comprehensive and robust and beautiful picture of what the truly good life is that embraces the reality of what it means to be human in all of our brokenness. Thank you. So I think we got some time for some Q&A.
Yes,
Yep.
we do. We have 20 minutes. Let me start. We had some questions that came in, several different ones, and I'll open this one from the question received, then we can go to the floor if you have questions as well. This question came in several different ways. From a basic reading of the text, and I think what they mean by text is a Sermon on the Mount, it seems that Jesus states that you're liable for judgment if you commit sins like lust and anger, and that you'll only receive blessing if you embody a certain character. How do you reconcile these statements with a Protestant understanding of God's grace through faith alone? So, yeah,
Okay.
there are several questions of
Yeah,
that,
that's
of,
okay. That's
of the
good.
engagement of the
Yeah.
Sermon on the Mount and a teaching of life.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'll try to answer that in the best way I can. So what I think is going on in the Sermon on the Mount overall is Jesus is presenting us a comprehensive vision for a way of life that we're made for. And what he's challenging is the closest thing to a way of life that ends up being the farthest things from it, which is the way of religion. Right? I mean, Jesus' number one people of conflict in Matthew particularly are the Pharisees, which I always say to my students, we need to understand the Pharisees, they were the good guys in Jesus' day. I know Pharisee is just a totally negative term now, even in broader culture. But you have to understand the Pharisees, they were morally upright, right? They were had the whole Bible memorized usually. They were highly trained. They were very faithful in terms of tithing and all the laws. They not only obeyed all the laws, this is going to sound snarky, I don't mean it that way, they even made up other laws to make sure they didn't accidentally disobey the laws. They really thought hard about how to apply Scripture. So, for example, let's say you're a Jewish person and you know the commandment about not working on the Sabbath. Okay, that's fine. But you have to think about what is okay and what is not. If someone needs to give birth, is it okay to walk 5 miles to help them? If you have an animal fall into a pit, this is one of the ones the rabbis talked about. There's a million cases where you have to think about what's work and what's not. That's the kind of stuff the Pharisees and the rabbis really thought a lot about. They said, they had a whole thing called the Tractate 39 of the Mishnah is about, or that's not the number, but they have 39 different categories of what work is so that you can think about. So I'm just saying all this, the Pharisees, they were the religious people, right? They were the really good guys of the day. They were not liberals. They were morally upright. Yet he calls them hypocrites. Why? because their hypocrisy was not that they're living a double life, like they're looking like they're religious and then they're sleeping around or whatever. They were hypocrites in the more powerful way in that they had all the externals, but they had lost a heart connection to God. And what the metaphor Jesus uses for that is that their tree is not truly good, and therefore the fruit, even though it looks like fruit, is not truly good. All right? And so I think what the Sermon on the Mount is very powerfully about, and it's a message to us, right? That's what we all especially have to realize. The Sermon on the Mount is not for us to put our arm around Jesus and say, yeah, you get him, right? You get those religious, stick it to the man, right? It's not at all. The Sermon on the Mount is for us to look inside and recognize, oh, as Christians, or at least church-going people, we can end up exactly like the Pharisees, and that we can be really good on the outside and lose a connection with God on the inside. In fact, religion is the best way to not pay attention to who you really are on the inside. So what the Sermon on the Mount is doing is Jesus is lovingly but pointedly putting his finger in that wound or prying open our hearts to recognize we have to pay attention to what's really going on, because it is necessary to have a righteousness greater than the scribes and Pharisees to enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm not just making that up. That's quoting Jesus in Matthew 5:20. And what that means is a righteousness. God does care about us doing what is right, doing his will, right? Who is my mother and brother and sisters, Jesus says? The one who does the will of the Father in heaven. Who is the wise one whose life survives versus the foolish builder? The one who hears my words and does them, right? I mean, it's just a constant refrain. You have to do the will of God. If we don't think that, I don't know what Bible you're reading. You have to do the will of God to be a Christian. The issue is that to do the will of God is not just an external reality. It's something that comes from a transformation in the heart that then imperfectly over time bears fruit in our lives. We're sinful and we're broken and we fail, but it is a message of an invitation to transformation. So I don't know if that answers the question. I like everything I said. I don't know if it answers I mean, I basically see your question as an opportunity for me to say more of the things I want to say. So feel free to ask the questions, and I will somehow mold it into what I want to say anyways. But
was great.
I don't know if that answers directly. So thank you. Yeah, good. Yes, that's right. In the good sense, right? Thank you. Other questions, or you have some more? Yep.
Yeah, anyone have questions before I've...
Or follow up on that if you want to. I mean, that was a super quick version of a 350-page book, so, but yeah.
I'm glad you used the words flourishing and drug my head out of happiness and even out of joy. Because my definitions of happiness and joy really are of this world.
Right.
Just of this world. You know, I have only glimpses of other joyful things. And I honestly believe, for me, the strongest direction of flourishing that I'm striving for is contentment in all things.
Yeah.
Okay? And I can't use the term joy or happy along with contentment, although there may be flavors of that.
Because you feel like joy and happiness are just too thin and temporary of words?
Yeah, because I'm being called to walk as a stranger in a strange land.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree. I mean, the word happy, again, is probably too weak to use. I don't use it a lot. I guess I use it a lot today. But flourishing is probably better. Rejoicing, though, is a real thing, and joy is a real thing. It all kind of depends on how we define these words, right? Happiness used to be stronger. So if you read 18th century English writers, take Jonathan Edwards as an example, he's going to use happiness in a way more like flourishing, right? But the word over time loses its strength. So I understand that a lot of us wouldn't want to use that word now. And maybe joy too. Maybe joy has become too weak and people just think of it as like happy temporarily or something. I don't know. And again, the same thing will happen with flourishing. That's the bummer, is that words just get tired over time. But
That's why I like to read the Amplified.
yes, well, that's one way. Yeah, sometimes. Although those words get tired too, unfortunately. But yeah, so I think that, I think it is important that we define flourishing, happiness, whatever it is, along the ways I'm suggesting today, that it includes suffering and the reality of that. But I also wouldn't want to exclude a deep sense of happiness, even joy and even laughter at times, you know. But I do like the word contentment, which is a very biblical word as well. It's interesting. That's one of the places in Philippians where I think Paul is very explicitly interacting with his Stoic hearers, because contentment, aparaxia, was one of the key Stoic ideas. It was kind of the goal, that you be content by being free from attachments to all things in the world, right? And I think that's a really good example of how Paul in the New Testament is interacting with the culture of his day and changing. So he says, I've learned to be content. In other words, so if you imagine you've got a room of people that are like, I'm about contentment, you know, and the key to contentment is being detached. He says, I've learned to be content, right? And what's his answer? But how? That's true. In all these places, which is exactly the Stoics. I mean, if you read those first few verses in Philippians, what's the verse? Any Stoic would say, dang right, that's awesome. But then what's the twist? What's he say? Yeah, but how? Through Christ who strengthens me, right? So in other words, he's addressing the same issue of like being content. I love the word contentment, but not being content by detaching from the world, or I'm afraid this is what many Christians have done, saying, well, someday things will get better, which is true, but it's more nuanced than that. In other words, we don't find contentment by just saying, well, this life is horrible and someday it'll be better. That's not actually contentment. That's not actually Christian contentment. It's possible to actually have happiness, joy, flourishing, whatever you're going to call it, even in the midst now of suffering. I'm not saying that's easy to do, but it is possible. And part of our problem in the history of Christianity is that we increasingly did defer the idea of flourishing to being something in the future. And I think that has not been helpful to the faith, right? Because it becomes this kind of pie in the sky kind of future orientation that loses the sense of life now. And I'm not saying you're doing that, of course, but I'm just saying those are some of the wrestlings that I think the nuance of what the Bible's teaching on this issue. So, thanks. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So where does peace fall into all of
Yeah, I think peace is basically contentment. So peace, contentment, shalom, this sense of settledness, centeredness, even in the midst of difficulty, I think is the idea. And again, it's going to fluctuate. It's not like in every moment we become like, you know, so detached that we don't ever feel upset. Of course we do, right? But there's this constant spiraling towards a greater maturity of more centeredness over time, that through suffering, through difficulties, we learn to be content or have peace or have shalom even in the midst of all of that. And confidence, yeah. It's that, which is hope. It's the hope, and that's based on the hope, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You just mentioned at the end of your last sort of explaining.
Dialogue, or I mean, diatribe, I mean, yeah.
But when was there, that's so familiar to me that sort of as believers, we've had sort of we're slaves in this world, and then the next world is where the real peace, contentment, use any of the synonyms.
Yeah, yeah.
When did, kind of using your terminology earlier with the Stoics and the early Christians,
Yeah.
when did that shift occur?
Yeah, it's complicated, as you can imagine. It varies, but it probably, I mean, some people put it as early as Augustine, and sometimes it's partly his fault, which makes me sad because I love Augustine so much. But for sure, by medieval Christianity, there's an increasing sense of that true happiness is only found in the future, and the complexity is that's true. You know what I mean? This is where the nuance is. It's like it's right to say that true happiness is only found in the future. In fact, this is what the great Christian theological category of the beatific vision means, which is something Protestants don't talk as much about, but has been a big part of the Christian tradition. That beatus, hear that word again? The beatific vision, the idea is that we will be truly happy when we see God. That's what beatific vision means, okay? And so this that's not wrong. I mean, that is, we will only be truly happy when we see God. The problem is it got increasingly deferred only to that, and it varies. I think the Protestant Reformation was probably part of the problem too, in the sense of like it contributed to that, and it's hard to say. I mean, there's a book about it if you want to read it. It's an academic book. It's by Ellen Cherry called God and the Art of Happiness, and this is what she argues. Her point is that Christian theology has increasingly gotten away from the idea of human flourishing, and it's a problem. But the story of how we got there is complex always, So, yep.
Can you put more words into what you said about pay attention to who you are on the inside? Like,
Yeah.
kind of expand what that looks like, let's say.
Yeah, so the idea of paying attention to who we are on the inside. Yeah, the primary metaphor Jesus uses is fruit and tree and fruit. And the idea is that the kind of tree we are, that is a person of increasing character, wholeness is the main idea, that our insides match our outsides. The way the Greek philosophers talked about virtue, which is what I think the Bible's talking about, is that our reasoning, our affections, and our actions are all harmonious. That's the idea of virtue, that there's a wholeness. Teleos is the Greek word for it. So there's a completeness or a wholeness between, we might say head, heart, and hands, even if you want. And that when there's not a consistency between those, then that's not truly virtuous, and therefore you'll never be happy. So the only way to be truly happy, according to the ancient philosophical system, which I think is the same in the Bible, is to be a whole person. The word virtus actually means human. And so the idea that a virtuous person is a fully human person because they're consistent between their head, heart, and hands. The word integrity, right? Or you think about, kind of traumatize you with some math here, but the difference between an integer and a fraction, right? An integer is a whole number. It's one thing as opposed to fractional. That's a good way to think about the difference between having integrity or virtue versus not. And a vice, so virtue and vice, a vice is what animals are. They're vicious. The word vicious comes from the word vice, right? So the difference between being a mere animal where you're just driven by your appetites and being a human where you're driven by virtue is that you are intentionally seeking to develop your interior person and a consistency between these things. So that's kind of the general idea. With a Christian understanding, we also understand that it's going to be a process of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. A lot of times it's going to be a process of 1 step forward, sometimes 10 years of 5 steps backward. Everybody's story is different. There's going to be brokenness. There's going to be failure. There's going to be weakness. There's going to be success. There's going to be joy. There's going to be numbness. There's going to be apathy. I mean, our lives are so complicated. But the vision Jesus is giving is a constant invitation to look inside, be open to the Lord, and by the power of the Spirit, become someone new. That's what Christianity is. Christianity is God at work in us by the power of the Spirit to make us fully human as Jesus himself was, to be reformed into his image. But just to recognize it's gonna be a process of starts and stops and failures, and that's okay.
And it's always
Yep.
going to be that way?
I think so, yeah.
No, I think that.
I mean, I think it is, yeah.
Rather, you're never
Yep.
going to achieve it.
Yep.
So we need to see it.
I totally agree, yeah.
Always going, next generation is going to have to deal with it and so forth, like that.
Yeah, and in our own, that's exactly right, in our own hearts, again, I'll just say for me, at 53, again, which is still a tender young age, I know for many of you, one of the things that I've been seeing is like layers of stuff I did not see about myself that was always there. So it's, for me right now, it's not even so much a season of backsliding or something, although that could happen to people, but actually my motives in that were even less pure than I thought.
So almost like if you have fruit, let's say,
yeah.
fruit, but you don't experience interpersonal flourishing, like to dig a little deeper in that.
Absolutely.
So I would think there's a lot of people who would say, we have fruit,
yeah,
but they wouldn't say say that they're flourishing. So,
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
kind of
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, again, I don't know if you were here this morning when I was like, busted. Just kidding. No, just kidding. Yes, I was just trapping you this whole time. There's a whole intervention just for you not coming to church this morning, right? No, just kidding. Yeah, no, totally fine. Just totally kidding. No, but I was talking about anxiety, and one of the things I said there, and a more general principle on it is that it's really important to pay attention to our negative emotions, especially like anger, because those negative emotions are windows into what's really going on in our hearts. And so if we have an external life that looks good, which is great, that's good, but we pay attention to the things that irritate us and make us angry or if we're bitter or whatever, those are indications there's something not quite right, right? No, and of course, it's gonna be true of all of us at some point, right? This afternoon, my wife busted me on some stuff I was complaining about. Between having lunch with you and me coming here, she rightly pointed out, I think that's a little bit like, argh. But she's totally right, right? I was complaining about something and not here, nobody here, but I was complaining about something back home and she's like, you seem to be saying a lot of negative things about that a lot. And like, yes, because I'm right, right? But the point is that's a gift, that's an opportunity for me to look inside and say, why am I upset about that? Like, even though I have a lot of fruit in my life, there's some area at least where there's something going on there that I need to pay attention to, because the fact that I'm irritated and complaining about it, that disturbance is an opportunity to pay attention. And that's how our lives are gonna be. You know, they're always gonna be complex and mixed like that. Does that answer your question? Or? Yeah, thanks. Yes, sir.
Occurred to me when you started with your opening question, you said we all have been influenced by parents and other adults in our life, teachers, I guess. What would be your advice for us to leave a legacy? To make an impression on people that we might mentor. Yeah. As to what happiness is for them.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful question. Thank you. Well, I mean, I would be very happy to ask you the same. Seems that you've probably been at this longer than I have, but the first thing that comes to mind for me, and I feel like has been a real transformative thing in recent years for me as I've thought about human flourishing, really comes back to the fruit of the Spirit. I don't know what you think about the fruit of the Spirit. I mean, I'm not sure none of you are opposed to it or something, but I just mean, I don't know what role you think it plays in the Christian faith. For me, it has become more and more and more important as like this primary way of thinking about what it means to be a Christian. I mean, really, it's just like, that is what matters to me the most. We're always gonna be imperfect, but like, I don't care how talented or how many books somebody's written or what a great preacher or teacher they are. If their lives or my life isn't marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, I don't really care about any of the other apparent fruits or gifts. I mean, ideally, we'll have gifted people and those things, but it has just struck me over and over the years that that's really those are the criteria, it seems, that are evidence of God at work in us. Imperfectly, we're always gonna stumble, right? We're gonna make mistakes, and struggles. But what I would want for my kids, right, is for them to say he was a person of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and gentleness. So that's the legacy I would want. Have you guys ever heard of the difference between resume virtues and eulogy virtues? You ever heard of that exercise? It's a really good exercise to do, where you think like what would you want your eulogy to be? And if the things that would be said at your funeral would be, all the great things you did at your job or whatever, I mean, those can be fine. Those are good resume virtues, but they're not really what you would want to be who you are, And for me as a Christian, I think the fruit of the Spirit. How would you answer that? I'm curious.
Well, I thought about this a lot at this point in my life.
Yeah, please.
What would people say about me?
Yeah, what did you?
And hoping it's not too late.
Yeah, it's not. Do you mind sharing anything that's come to mind? Okay, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, thanks for being vulnerable about that. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it and how you led into all this about what we think happiness is.
Sounds like there's a big but coming. Right? No.
Right. Really, this isn't so much a question.
Yeah, that's fine. Always welcome.
Comment, but it might prompt a response.
Yeah, please.
from you, but, throughout our lives, there's some more on one end of their life than the other end of their life.
Mm-hmm.
We've been bought into this vision of what happiness is. It's like, okay, we have a choice. I can be happy, or I can serve Jesus, go to Africa, and be a missionary, and
That's what I'm trying to push against a little bit. Yeah, right.
and not be happy. So in a sense, we've kind of said, well, I'll check the box by going to church on Sunday or being a Christian and just trying to have some of these fruits of the Spirit we bump into, but we're still sort of bought into this dichotomy about really deep inside what do we think our true happiness is. And it's not going to be easy to kind of reset our goalposts, so to speak, in terms of what happiness is.
Yeah, thank you. So just to make sure everybody can hear the question online as well. Yeah, just recognizing that, yeah, it's hard to reset that. And we've often, if I'm understanding what you're saying, we've often been told that there's a difference between maybe serving Jesus and being happy, or maybe, am I representing what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think you kind of touched on this some with one of your earlier responses too about when I think you sort of touched on it.
Yeah.
About future happiness when we get to heaven versus.
That's right. Yeah, it's not all deferred. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a sense in which I think we think we'll only truly be happy in heaven, so while on earth we might as well be happy in the earthly ways.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think what's really helpful, and I know our time's up here, sorry. What's helpful and with this is that the, just experience and like statistics and analysis shows that all the things that we think are going to make us happy now don't really. I mean, like money is the most obvious one. We always joke in our family, money can't buy you happiness, but I'm sure willing to give it a shot, right? but the reality is it really doesn't. And you really see this, especially with second half of life, when people would, start to kind of like pay attention, like I've accomplished, and now what does it matter? And it really doesn't, And so there's a gift there to us in our own lives, and even observing other people, that happiness really isn't found in these things that are the opposite of Jesus. It's not down there. And that also means then that it's not that we can't have happiness in Jesus. Actually, what Jesus offers is the true way of happiness, which is focusing on love and relationships and embracing with reality the suffering and the brokenness of ourselves and others, right? So in other words, it's not like we have to just defer that. It's like he's redefining what true happiness is, and it turns out he's right. You know what I mean? Because the other ways that are the opposite of that don't even satisfy now, let alone in the future, is the point. So, yeah, thanks for that comment. Yeah, I think we're out of time, sorry.
So sorry, we had lots more questions than we could get to. We will have their books for sale right outside these doors, Jonathan's books. But as we close tonight, can we just say thank you to you? What a powerful,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Feel free to hang around, talk. We are not kicking you out for any reason, but we do have our student ministry, Ask Me Anything, happening. So if you're wanting to head to that starts in a few minutes. So anyways, also as we close, just want to give you a heads up. Our next On series is planned for the fall, September 10th, on gender. We're going to talk about the conversation happening in our culture today on gender identity. Mark, do you want to say anything about that? Or are you good? Okay, great. That's maybe all you need right now, but we have a great speaker coming and speaking to her life as she has battled gender and coming to faith in Jesus. So September 10th, and mark your calendar for that. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a great night.